So I want to do three quick videos that will illustrate some examples of role making. Some of these are developed in the chapter. Some of them are developed in the readings by Ebaugh or Cahill or Goffman or some combination of all of those. So excuse me. Um, feel free to take what you hear and learn in the lecture and align it and synchronize it as much as possible with what you see in the source materials. Okay, so let's start with aligning actions. Aligning actions are essentially things that we are going to do um, that will reconnect our actual and our virtual identities. So the primary researchers who have contributed to developing this particular um, um, set of examples of role making are people like Scott and Lyman, whose work on accounts back in the late 60s is pretty invaluable. Hewitt and Stokes in the mid 70s did some important work on disclaimers. And of course, Goffman in 1952 writes a seminal piece on cooling out as a collaborative strategy for getting people to accept and um, sort of reorient themselves to to an alternative but acceptable social identity when the one that they have has been sort of compromised. So all of these things utilize what we call vocabularies of motive. I should say, let me back up. Accounts and disclaimers utilize vocabularies of motive. Cooling out is a little bit different. Mills, C. Wright Mills, the guy who gave us the sociological imagination, Mills defines vocabularies of motive as a set of words or phrases or rhetoric that we use that are intended to provide legitimate explanations or so-called legitimate explanations for our actions. What happens in a number of different social interactions is that the identity that we are expected to have, which we call the virtual identity, and the identity that we actually establish in the minds of other people, which we call the actual identity, those things can become discrepant. They can become unaligned. And we need to say something that will bring them back into alignment when they've been misaligned, or that will explain away a potential misalignment that is about to unfold, potentially based on things that we're about to do or things that we're about to say. And again, all of this will be a little bit more clear, um, um, as we go into this a little bit more in depth. All right, so actual identity, virtual identity, right, have to be or are expected to be in alignment. Something happens, something is done, something is said, something occurs, and suddenly there's a discrepancy. So what you need to do in those instances is you need to provide an account. Now, an account is a statement that's made to explain unexpected, inappropriate, or questionable acts. There are two types, excuses and justifications, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the thing that's really important to remember in keeping these things straight in your mind, I think, is that accounts come after, right? So something has been done, something that has been said that is inappropriate, and now, in essence, a person needs to engage in some degree of damage control. And that's going to require some improvisation because normally, right, the way that we are judged or viewed as acceptable or appropriate in the minds of other people is when our behaviors align with the role expectations of the statuses that we occupy and the circumstances we find ourselves in. When that doesn't happen, we kind of have to go off script. We have to find a way to, again, to account for. It's really a process of attribution, right? To what do we attribute this discrepancy? And if we can externalize if we can externalize the cause of the discrepancy, we can offer up an excuse, in other words, then what will happen is people will see the discrepancy not as an indictment of us or an indication that we are in some way um, um, not up to the role, we're not up to the status, but rather that circumstances are preventing us from being able to do that. So excuses are accounts, but they're accounts in which we admit our conduct is wrong and deny responsibility for it, right? So it's not my fault is kind of a classic excuse, right? And so what you're trying to say is, somebody's got a view of you in which your virtual identity and your actual identity are out of alignment. You want to bring the actual identity back up to the expectation or back in line with the expectation by shifting the responsibility for the discrepancy off of you, so it doesn't attach to you, and that's again a way of getting somebody to reevaluate or um, um, understand differently the actual identity, right? So accounts are always about changing perceptions of one's actual identity in the minds of others. A justification is a little bit different. It's also an account. We accept responsibility for engaging in an inappropriate act, which is different than an excuse where we're saying it's not our fault. In the case of justification, we're saying, yes, I did this, but it shouldn't be seen as inappropriate. And then we might offer up a narrative or a story, in essence, a vocabulary of motive to explain why our discrepant behavior is in fact perhaps appropriate to the moment, right? So if you're coming home late from a party and your parents ask you, hey, it's after curfew, where have you been? Right now, there's this discrepancy between how you are expected to be seen and how you're actually being seen. You're not going to try to shift responsibility for the discrepancy away from your behavior, but rather you're going to try to explain it by saying, I had something more important, right? I had to take my friend home because he had too much to drink, right? So there's an acknowledgement that you have in fact engaged in a behavior that creates a break between the expectation and reality, but that you are justified in not meeting that expectation. In this case, the curfew. So again, they're going to come after, and they're basically meant to sort of realign the actual and virtual identities by shifting how people see the actual identity. That's really, really important. All right, so those are accounts. Disclaimers come before. Now, disclaimers, according to Hewitt and Stokes, are rationales that we offer prior to taking part in questionable behavior. We are about to do something that potentially will create a gap between how we are seen and how we are expected to be seen. Before that happens, before we actually engage in that activity, we might say something to sort of explain it before it occurs, right? And that would be a disclaimer. So every statement that begins with the phrase, "I'm not a racist, but," is almost inevitably going to be followed by something that somebody could interpret as racist, right? So you're about to say something that other people could interpret as racist. You don't want to be seen as racist, but you also want to express this particular thought or idea. So to reform people's expectations of you, in other words, to reshape the virtual identity so that it will be in line with the actual identity that is about to be expressed, you will offer up that disclaimer. It doesn't have to be something as socially odious as racism. It could be, you're about to give a speech in your speech class, and you're very, very nervous. Nervous people tend not to give very good speeches. So you might say something to the effect that, "I'm not very good at public speaking," or "I've never done this before," or "I'm really, really nervous." And what you're doing is you're changing the expectation, or at least you are offering up a narrative or a vocabulary of motive that will provide your audience, if you will, a legitimate reason why the thing that they're about to observe may not meet what expectations they brought into that interaction. Now, it's really interesting. I'm going to pause here to note this because I think it's really something that you guys should pay attention to. To do this, you have to be able to put yourself in the position of your audience, right? To craft a presentation like this, sort of on the fly, if you will, to improvise a particular role performance in the face of a disruption to the existing role performance requires you to be conscious of the others with whom you're interacting. You're still putting yourself in their position. You're still engaging in that reflexive behavior in which you're using somebody else's viewpoint to have a sense of yourself from their point of view, so that you know what sort of accounts or what sort of disclaimers are most likely to be acceptable and understood by your audience. The improvisational aspect to it is that sometimes these disruptions that cause or that necessitate an account, or the potential disruptions that are going to necessitate a disclaimer, are often unanticipated, and we have to kind of craft our role performance sort of in that moment, and that's something that again, you get better at the more that you know about your audience. The more the situation that you're in is a situation that's familiar both to you and to them. When you do these things around strangers, or when you do these things in larger groups where there are more perspectives to manage and to sort of try to take into consideration, obviously this gets a little bit harder. All right, last one is cooling out. Now, cooling out comes from the language of con artists and grifters. The longer phrase is cooling out the mark. The mark, of course, is the person who gets taken advantage of in a scam. And if the person in a scam who is being taken advantage of discovers that they are in fact being taken advantage of, it is very, very important that the person's emotional state and sense of self be managed by the people perpetuating the scam, so that this person won't engage in something unpredictable or potentially disadvantageous to the grift or to the scam. So the way you do that, of course, is you offer up an alternative identity. You can't, if you've had your identity disrupted, if you've lost face, if you've become embarrassed, sometimes an identity is too damaged or too compromised to kind of hold on to. So what cooling out the mark requires, or what cooling out requires, is that you be offered an alternative, right? So in cooling out, what you're doing is you're persuading somebody who's been embarrassed, somebody who's lost face, you're persuading them to accept a less desirable but still reasonable alternative identity. The person who gets dumped in a relationship is told by their friends that they're better off without this person, that there are other people, better people that they could be in relationships with. People who get taken advantage of are often told that lots of people fall for these kinds of things. It's not a way of saying you're not gullible, but maybe a way of saying you're at least no more gullible than anybody else, which, I admit is possibly cold comfort. But the idea here is that there are other sort of alternative identities to the one that was just compromised through a set of unforeseen or unanticipated circumstances. So cooling out is what you do in that instance. Now, the interesting difference between cooling out on one hand and accounts and disclaimers on the other is the degree to which cooling out requires collaboration with social others, right? You need a team of people who will step up, friends, family members, colleagues, who will step up and reassure you that this embarrassing moment isn't something that is going to kind of permanently compromise your identity, that you do in fact have alternatives. Accounts and disclaimers come from us, but cooling out comes from others. And that is a really, really important distinction, and one that I hope, you guys hang on to and keep keep track of, because that is probably the major distinction between the first two kinds of aligning actions and cooling out on the other hand. And I think that should do it for aligning actions. So the next time we'll talk a little bit about role exit. So until then, I'll just say have a good one.